And thank you to people who've just joining us. Um, in the first part of this session, I introduced the regulatory room and our charter and the way we'll work. And we then started to look at the work that Tomi Henttinen has been doing on revising our roadmap. And I think there were a number of points that came up. Tomi will share the key slide in a minute, I hope. But we had a good discussion around some things which were probably needed adding to our roadmap. One of the issues that came up was the increasing interest in regulating embedded carbon. And it's clear that both Finland and France have got implementations of those issues, of those challenges. And we should probably include some of those things into our roadmap. Not that we can dictate how these things should be calculated, but we can certainly, well, we should certainly look at whether we could do a project on the information requirements for those kinds of assessments. Elsewhere in the world, I think the emphasis is still on regulating energy use or energy consumption and carbon generation in the in-use stage. And that's already included in the work that we're doing in our regulatory information requirements project. We also talked about the question of whether there could be a qualification for regulators. buildingSMART has a compliance thread which currently supports the basic BIM qualification, but the next stage has always, well, has been talked about, is to provide further professional qualifications for different roles. I think we need to be much more confident about what the curricula, what the agenda for a regulator's qualification would be. And that may come out of the work we're doing on guidance for regulators, which is a working group that has just started to prepare a document, particularly because regulators are it's difficult to get them to attend meetings or conferences, so we want to have a document that we can send them to educate around the world, and not only what the steps are, but also examples from around the world. And we heard the particularly significant news that in a week or two, the legislation in Finland should be accepted, which will make IFC mandatory for regulatory submissions in the building sector. And that's pretty exciting. And it'll be something that we can all we'll all follow with interest. But there are other examples that we're collecting around the world, and I think the examples are going to be as important as the recommendations. Another topic that came up was should the regulatory room look at rule languages and ways of sharing rules and making the rules machine readable. And Tomi expressed the opinion that that was out of the scope because it's not IFC. My own view, and maybe we should debate this a little, is that it is in scope. You can represent rules within IFC, but also I think that the challenge of interoperability should not only include IFC, which is about solutions in the built environment, but it should include interoperability about requirements in the built environment. If we're going to have a good ecosystem of software that supports checking. If everything is specific and has to be tailored to individual regulations in each country, and if each country changes those regulations well, in the UK it's every 3 years, and of course sometimes it's done at very short notice, and so we need to think about how we're going to be flexible enough to cope with the fact that the regulatory environment changes. So these were the issues that have come up so far. Tomi, are you ready to share your screen? I think if you share the main diagram, we've got two new faces in the room, and perhaps you could just do a quick summary of the roadmap, and then we'll ask on two new faces to introduce themselves and see if they have any comments. Okay, Tomi, guide us through. This is the old roadmap.
Yep. Yeah, just very quickly, there's other stuff. Maybe I should. Maybe it's something that kind of the big vision is to head towards automated regulatory processes, and kind of this is the big vision, and so that we are kind of moving away from the manual traditional workflow against towards the building information modeling workflow, and at the same time things should be more automated, and there's in this transition there's of course several steps, and even those steps can take place at the same time, kind of that there's kind of a digital and hybrid, they go in parallel, but this is kind of the big picture. And then if we look at the current roadmap, what we have, as I explained in the previous session, it's not really a work program. It's not about projects. It's more like identifying subjects that we need to cover. And in this roadmap that we developed 2018 and then revised in 2019, it's more like kind of we set up, or we identified kind of things which are low-hanging fruits, which are maybe easier to achieve than maybe projects or items which are more complicated, and then of course long-term ambitions. And we then set up the desired state for each of the swim lanes: engagement, technology, implementation, evaluation, and sustain of the roadmap and the tasks. And now what we have discussed in this round about how to update, or what we need to do to update, is to talk more about how to make these two projects.
Tomi, but could you run through the desired states? Because I think that gives a good indication of where we were thinking a few years ago.
Yeah, of course. So the desired states, as we stated some years ago, was the first one. We wanted to have the governments, or we wanted to kind of form up a platform, a forum where governments could collaborate and share knowledge concerning automated permitting and the processes that that they need. There has been, over the years, there has been a lot of discussions, and we have seen also some presentations about the automatic code checking. I think that this is kind of still a desired state, and but that was the first one, the engagement swim lane, to kind of form up a forum where governmental parties could collaborate. And then second one, technology. Well, we basically here in buildingSMART, we are about technology. This is our core kind of function. And our desired state was a complete set of standards that support the automated regulatory processes, and also to have the software vendors involved and the software to support these standards. Then buildingSMART is becoming more and more about implementation. So that was also one of our swim lanes. So the desired state was to have a widespread and a consistent governmental demand for these standards, and also a capability to fulfill the demand. And then the last two ones, the last bottom ones, were more like internal ones. Maybe the evaluate, there was kind of, for example, developing metrics and KPIs for how to measure the performance. But the desired states was consistent metrics and measurement processes, and also to have some a channel for the regular feedback of the maturity of the how the things are going in the national level. And then finally, sustain the desired state was a harmonized regulatory processes and to keep up with relevant standards and guidelines. So those were kind of the goals that we had 4 years ago, and at least how I look this today, I think that those goals are pretty much the same. We can do some fine tuning, but more or less, I think that those are still valid. But for this round, I guess that now what we need to do is to try to make projects, and we have already done. We have followed the roadmap already. So we have a couple of projects. The biggest one at the moment is regulatory information requirements project, which is developing or not developing, but more like gathering and trying to identify the technical base that can be used to fulfill the regulatory use cases. And by use cases, we mean, for example, fire zoning, escape routes, energy, things that the regulators are checking from the using the IFC models, or could check using the IFC models. Also, part of the project was to develop some kind of guidance to implement those properties and to link the properties in, because there's lots of, or at least in the beginning when we started the project, we kind of had an idea, which might still be valid, that there's lots of local development done in this field, but in a way we need to have a common language to combine or to link the local development to international IFC standard. And of course we have the BSDD, the buildingSMART Data Dictionary, that can help us with that goal. So that is one of the projects. And then we have so we have also another project. I already started to put this a little bit forward. So we have the guidance for regulators project, which is like Nick said, it's still in early stages and forming up, but it's kind of picking. If I go a little bit back in to the previous version of the roadmap, so it's kind of picking up the things, the goals that we had in the previous version of the roadmap. And what has been discussed in the task group meetings is that more or less the goals that we have in this roadmap are still valid, but we have to make we need to be more concrete. We need to put them on timeline. And today in the previous session we discussed about what kind of projects we could have, and based on that, during the coffee break I already started to kind of put these things in different places, and like it was noted that are we too ambitious with this? I think that we have to be realistic what we have with what we can do. I extended the timeline a bit so that maybe that's more realistic, and also we need to, I think that we need to discuss in this session, we need to discuss that which of the goals or which of the identified tasks can be actually put into projects, or can be kind of be developed to projects. So that's where we are at the moment.
Okay, thank you. What I'd like to do now is just to give our two new attendees a chance to introduce themselves and ask them if they have any thoughts, because the roadmap is really trying to lay down what we ought to be doing, and so the challenge questions is to ask if they have any thoughts on that, and then we'll just connect with the online community to see if they're generating any thoughts which may be relevant. So please do introduce yourself and start with any comments you may have on what we're doing.
That's a very nice invitation. My name is Henttinen. I come from the Netherlands. I am manager standards at the National BIM Office. And the main task or the main question I receive nearly every week is how can we set up regulations to make sure that everyone uses the BIM standards.
Right.
So the Dutch government is interested in setting up regulations. And that's the reason for why I'm here.
Right.
And one of the things I would like to know is, do we have an overview or insight from other countries, what other countries doing, and where are they, and what is already compulsory in those countries?
Yeah. That's a couple of good challenges for us. We try and keep an eye and get presentations, particularly during our open house meetings, which happen every 6 months between the summits. And we try and get presentations of what's going on. And we certainly want to put case studies into the guidance for regulators document that we're producing. That, as I said, the thinking is that I'm very glad to see you here. But it has been difficult to get regulators to come to summits and join in, so we need a document to go and talk to them. And I think in the last couple of years, there have been some really exciting developments. We've heard from Estonia, where they are getting ready to pilot some online regulation. With no compulsion, but with an opportunity for people to submit with an IFC model. We've also heard this morning from Tomi that Finland is about to legislate or to enact legislation which will make IFC mandatory for some projects for submissions. And earlier this summer, there was an announcement that a small community in Finland had been the first to grant permission for a building based purely on an IFC submission. I think that title might belong with Singapore. from 2 decades ago. But the talk, I mean, clearly there's mounting excitement. We heard last 3 months ago in our open session from Abu Dhabi, where they have a system which is going to go live, which is quite exciting. And I think other countries are at the stage of research and development. We heard from Portugal, where there's a research project. And I've been involved with the UK project called DCOM, Digital Compliance, which finished in the summer. I'll say it was successful, and we're still producing material to disseminate that. So I think, yeah, one of the things that we want to do in the room is to be aware of what's going on, and to place it on that spectrum between low-hanging fruit and advanced applications, and proof of concept through to full implementation. So we try and track these things. But our main mission at the moment is within the next year and a half is to produce guidance for regulators. And I think there'll be enough examples from people who are pressing ahead to really be helpful for people who are following on. So that's what we're trying to do. One of the things that we discussed or started to discuss in the break is, is it too ambitious? And I'm going to say we've put a timeline on. It takes as long as it takes, as long as, depending on what the commitments are. It has been difficult to get projects funded because of the fact that what we're looking at is what Tamir El-Dirabi, professor in Toronto, said it's a social value network. It's something where the regulators have got to gain some advantage from the technology. The applicants have got to gain, and there's also a public interest, and with some other actors. You have to keep everyone happy if you're going to move to automated code compliance. If any one group is not on board with the idea, then it won't happen. So it's not a business case in the old sense of I'll do it because it's worth it for me. We've actually got to move several parts of the industry at the same time to get it to work. And because it involves several actors, that's one of the reasons why it's hard to get funding. And what funding means is that people can devote time to the projects we want to carry out. So I think we should probably have a discussion about funding in a moment or two. But before we do that, I hope that's helpful. We have one other attendee. New attendee.
I'm Lorenzo Nissi from Italy. I'm the Vice President and General Director of the buildingSMART Italian chapter. So I'm here because in Italy, I think we need to stimulate the interest in this field. And we just could have some small funding. So in the next couple of years, we will be able to have, to try at least to find who could be the stakeholder enough ready to understand what we are talking about and try to test some possibility. So I wanted to understand what was the roadmap, what was the vision here, and try to. And I hope, hopefully, in the next year or two, we will be able to provide some experience and share.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, I think the thing that Tomi and I and the steering committee agreed on is that the challenge of regulatory involvement through to automated compliance, it's the ultimate challenge for BIM and what we're digitization of the industry, because it represents the outside world looking at what the industry has been doing with IFC and with BIM for years and saying, now it's good enough to involve outside parties like regulators. And if we pass that test, then we've achieved a level of quality in what we're doing, which will bring in lots of other use cases which perhaps don't stand on their own right, like fire simulation or well, into other processes which need a certain level of quality of information. And the regulatory challenge is very often the one that says, this is the information you must provide. These are the questions you must answer, and so on. So that's why perhaps we have fewer funded projects, but we think it's really important. I mean, the challenge now is to our audience in the room and anyone online to come forward with any comments that they would like on what we're doing. If anyone has any suggestions on how to get the work funded so we can move faster, I'd love to hear about that, because I think compared with other rooms, that's our weak point, to actually get funding. And all the time that we rely on some really brilliant voluntary effort, that will, that sets the pace at which we can do things. If we get funding for projects, then people can devote significant quantities of time to moving things forward. So yes, we welcome commitments and involvement and what we call in-kind donations of effort. But I think to really tap into the expertise that's in the regulatory room and the people who contribute, funding would make an enormous difference, and so on. So let me just ask, are there any questions or comments coming through?
Not just yet. We'll give it a little while.
Okay, well, let's throw it open to everyone in the room here then. Does anyone have any thoughts on our ambitions and what projects we should include? I think we've taken the point about embedded carbon as a topic to which we need to think about. I think we saw yesterday that it's a complicated subject, that people are it's easy. Okay, that's great news.
No, it's very easy, Nick.
Okay.
And I'm very serious. It's very easy because experts worked for 50 years to make a normal standard about that. So when you have a standard of calculation, it's very easy. When it starts to be a mess, it's when people who doesn't know the standard or will mismatch the footprint, the national declaration, and the LCA,
Okay.
that they make the mess.
Okay.
But otherwise, it's very, very well done and very clear. National declaration is made by the United Nations Environmental Program. It's signed by the countries. It's an accountancy approach based on financial flows and internal product mass. So it has nothing. It's
Okay.
regulated. It's very clear. It's come from the financial report of each country, and from that we deduce the greenhouse gas emission.
Right.
So this is the national declaration.
Okay.
Footprint, it's made by several agencies, and it's aggregated into the IPCC report. So it's also very clear. And life cycle assessment, it's very standardized based on European norms. So it's not
Okay.
complicated.
Okay.
The point where I spoke with the people from product groups, and they said, well, we can have a project immediately funded maybe by some industry makers, because they need to have a standardized European approach on how they deliver information about embedded carbon in their project. For the moment, in each country you have a different approach, and in each industry maker you have a different system. So this is a proposal that I discussed during the break.
Yeah.
With the project room.
Good.
That it could be a way to think about how buildingSMART can be involved in and work with them to have a standardized organization of Windows embedded of products that needs to be done anyway, because it's already done in France, it's done in Denmark, it's done in global countries. So how could we help the industry maker to say it once?
Yeah.
Because for the moment, they say several times.
My only hesitation is that buildingSMART is an international organization, and we must be careful not to build in CEN standards into buildingSMART. If the European chapters in buildingSMART want to get together and say, this is how we will do it in Europe, then it's an offering to the rest of the world. But we can't assume, we mustn't assume, because we will lose, America will lose the Middle East and the Far East if we assume that this is the answer. But we can offer it. So we must be respectful of that. I was involved with the initial development of ISO, I think it's 22054 for EPDs. There was a debate about whether the standard should be around data or object delivery. And I was advocating that it should be around specific objects and so on. I lost that argument, and so I think even 22054 now needs a buildingSMART interpretation on it, because they didn't want to do that. They wanted to effectively leave the control of the information with the manufacturers, and so there would be no standard interchange format, and so on. So I think we would need to start there, and say that what they've done is, well, one of the things we heard in the earlier session is that we need to make these assessments before product is known, and that requires decisions to be made about product averages, and in the UK there's a standard that says if you don't know, you take the average multiplied by 1.4, so you assume that you will be not a worst case, but a reasonably bad score until you can prove otherwise. And I think there are some ideas there that the industry would find very useful, to say, how do you progress from concept design to detailed design before you necessarily know all the individual products and so on. So I think there's a project there which can be done at the international level and can help implement the European rules. So that's now, I think, we would need quite a few technical experts to come forward, and we would need some IFC experts on board as well to bridge that gap. So it's not a to be honest, I don't think it could be done by voluntary effort, because I think it needs the support of agencies, and that's my challenge back to you, is to say, how do we get the people on board who should be on board? But the way it would work is that we make a project proposal. I didn't highlight that in the earlier things, but the room can formulate the problem. We need to make a project proposal, which will answer questions about who will be involved, does it require funding, and what the timescales are. and we can use that to invite involvement. So very happy to start that process and see if it has legs. The other topic that came up before the break is about sharing rules or sharing machine readable regulations and so on. And Tomi and I disagreed, which is probably a creative opportunity. First of all, the IFC can represent constraints, and constraints are rules, and rules are things like regulations. So we can stay within, even if we limit or define ourselves as working on IFC, we can do it. But I think there's a lot of technologies that have evolved in the last, since we did the technical report 5 or 6 years ago, to say, let's take another look at this. As an example, the ISO 12911 is about how to write BIM implementation plans in a structured way. But the structure is also a very good tool for thinking clearly about what rules mean and laying it out so that it can be made machine interpretable. And there are other techniques. So again, maybe we could make a community of software vendors to look at which approaches work. I'm very aware that there are dozens of formats that can be used for transmitting rules. Some of them have been proposed and then not developed, and so on. Some of them are new, and so on. So, but I think the key test is, are they expressive enough? As I said, some regulations are very simple, concise, and lots of individual clauses. My experience is that they're never that neat, or very rarely that neat. So that's another project which can see if there is support for. Because, and the justification is exactly the same as the justification for IFC, which is that no one vendor can produce a product that does everything. But by having a format that allows information to be shared, we create a market for all sorts of products. And I think we could do the same with requirements. It's not only regulations, although that, as I said, was to my mind, it's the gold standard. Clients have requirements. In infrastructure, there are lots of situations where, particularly road bodies, they make their own rules and requirements, and then they check themselves against it, and if they don't comply, they change the rules or give themselves a waiver. And it's not the same as the regulatory environment around buildings always. On the other hand, railways have a lot of regulations imposed on them because of the history of catastrophic failure in the 19th century. I mean, suddenly, in the 19th century, as railways expanded, the world got used to railway disasters. Didn't get used to or had to face up to railway disasters, and so the regulatory environment around railways it's very tight, but also very antiquated. Certainly in the UK, it is. And very difficult to shift. So that's another area where I think we could take things forward. And that I think would probably take a few years to get to a conclusion. Well, I don't know if we could ever get to a conclusion about interoperability of rules, but I think we could revisit it. And see if the old report needs updating. The old report was it was an observations. It was a catalogue of what was being done. And I think maybe the time has come to start being a little bit more assertive about the options. Any other comments on what we should do from Germany? What would you like to see the regulatory room addressing?
As I pointed out, the development of digitalization in building regulations would be a very, very interesting topic for us. And as you said, well, here we have to decide between you and Tomi on the automated reading. But I would share the opinion with you that that would be also an interesting option and advancement that buildingSMART should follow. Why not? But maybe let's use some arguments from Tomi why he is opponent to this. I didn't quite get it, to be honest. Maybe we should have a little discussion on this.
Okay, Tomi, do you want to comment on? Sorry, Edward from Germany has said that he's inclined to agree with me that rule formats and interoperability should be in scope. Any thoughts from your side on why we're wrong and you're right?
You mean that we are not that also other formats, not just IFC or buildingSMART standards? Is that kind of the question?
Yeah, I mean, your comment was that we shouldn't be getting into rule interoperability or requirements interoperability, and there's two people in the room that said that we should be.
Yeah.
Edward.
Yeah. At the end of the day, we cannot exclude, of course, we cannot exclude anything which is kind of connected to this. But at the same time, as I see that this is buildingSMART, and we are kind of we are committed to buildingSMART standards and buildingSMART strategy. So if we are doing something which is, if we are kind of stepping outside that kind of buildingSMART scope, then I think that we have to go to the board, or I don't know, but we kind of it's, in my mind, it's something that we cannot just do. We need to get the permission to do that. And but the second thing is that because there are so many things, and alone in the world of IFC, and well, if we extend that a little bit, that we are talking about data dictionaries, and we are, but basically if we are talking about the kind of the standards and the specifications that buildingSMART does in the world of BIM. buildingSMART is kind of producing technical standards and technical specifications, and if we are moving outside that scope, then the kind of the number of or the number of tasks is limitless. And in order to keep kind of the focus in one thing, I think that we need to kind of create some kind of a fence around the work that we do, in order to kind of say that, okay, this is our part of the kind of maybe the guidelines, or this is our part of the standards, or this is our part of the interoperability. And then if there are other kind of needs, and of course there are other needs, then maybe we just need to liaise with those projects and those initiatives.
Okay, I mean, I mentioned that the IFC has a constraint schema, which is my excuse, or to sidestep your objection. I think that it's only, at the moment, it's only in the academic community that people are thinking about rule interoperability to any degree of sophistication, and so I mean, I've fought this battle with the buildingSMART leadership to say, and they have accepted that regulations and requirements are in scope, and I think that's really important, because otherwise buildingSMART becomes, or could be seen as, lopsided if we're only about solutions and not about requirements. You know, we're not really answering the industry need. So we'll take that one forward and see and thrash it out. We need to achieve, well, we need to decide, subject to resources and so on. But I think we might get resources to help with that, because it would create a software market, and that's one of the role of standards, is to grow the market. Okay.
May I raise my question?
Yeah, of course.
I'm thinking about the what question. Here in the diagram, you say one of the possibilities is to set up or develop a machine-readable regulation. That's one option. The other option is the qualification framework of the vehicle. That's the second possibility. I've got some others as well. For example, take into account that the current regulators with current processes involve digitalization aspects, for example. So you have several possibilities or options to follow, but every option has another impact. A whole new regulation that takes 4 or 5 years. If you take the British example and say we would like to have BIM level 2, that is not a regulation, that's an industry agreement. That is maybe a year or, but it's not the law, at least what I think, but that it is the duration of a year or 2 years or something like that. And do we have a list of all possibilities, including the kind of impact?
We haven't taken these steps and scored them in any way. I think we because many of them we can't do straight away. That's a good idea. Some of them will require a lot of resource, and so it's a cost-benefit question, but to date the regulatory room has always moved forward. If there's an opportunity, we take it, and so on. And I think it's changed. You're right. We need to change a bit and have a more active set of decisions and policies as to what our priorities are. But the our 2 projects at the moment, the information requirements sort of came out of the realization that Finland, Estonia, and the UK was starting to formulate these things, and that if every country did their own, it would slow progress, and we should try and find a common ground, and that was agreed and got support for it. And the other one about the guidance document was it really evolved out of the open forums that we were holding online, where we were getting people coming on the calls with wildly differing understandings of what automated regulation meant. We had regulators coming on saying, we're not going to buy a copy of Revit and Bentley and ArchiCAD and Nemetschek, and so it's never going to happen. And this sort of reinforced or raised alarms that if regulators were assuming that they had to buy particular authoring tools and so on, there was obviously a learning gap. And we'd done a survey, and the interest was there, but we thought, there are a lot of barriers or imagined barriers that we needed to address.
What I was talking about, I think that the question was maybe kind of a. I'm actually talking about the same thing as was asked, and kind of, if I give an example, that if for example, if we are developing a framework, or if we are developing a language, kind of a regulation language, then we should keep in mind that, okay, this the language that we are developing here in buildingSMART is kind of, it needs to have a connection to IFC. So if there's because the regulatories, the building authorities, they are checking lots of things. They are, for example, checking that is the person qualified as an architect. And I think that kind of check is outside the scope of buildingSMART. But if the language or the regulation is checking that is the fire zoning correct in the design, then that has a direct connect to IFC, and then I can see that that's in our scope.
Nick, I have a question. Can you maybe explain what is going on in the regulatory information requirements project and how it links to this room?
Yeah, well, it is a project of this room.
Yeah.
I'll come to that in a minute. And what we've been doing is inviting countries to get involved. It's had a sort of slow launch over the last year and a half, getting countries involved. Some countries have got research projects, and in fact, they're covering the ground of what information is required for fire. There's some researchers in Germany that are doing fire regulation work, and so we expect to get their input. In the case of Finland, Estonia, and Scotland, and hopefully England and Wales, there are formal engagements and formal projects that are looking at these things. So that's where we're starting with those 4, but we're looking for inputs from other chapters, from governments or research projects, because what we want to answer is what are the common information requirements, properties, attributes, whatever you want to call them, which could form a common basis. We know that the way different countries use those attributes, how they combine them into a regulation, is different in every country, or varies a lot between different countries. But the things that they're interested in, fire compartments, material ratings, escape routes, these are all things that most regulations have in common. And so we want to find those commonalities and make sure that the core of the IFC and BSDD can represent them. We always take the example that in Finland there are regulations affecting saunas, or at least to get permission you have to document how many saunas you're providing in a building. I'm not sure of the details, but there will always be specific stuff from different countries. But if we can find the commonalities, and we're starting with zoning and fire and accessibility and energy consumption, or greenhouse gases and so on. We're just trying to find the maximum amount of commonality to give people a launch pad to then say, well, locally we need to add this, or in this country fire rating is expressed in minutes. In other countries expressed according to the European standard, and so on and so forth. So we'll recognize where the barriers are.
So basically, what we have done in the project, we will walk through this more in detail tomorrow. But what we have done exactly, what Nick in the way Nick explained that we first identified kind of the use cases, kind of common use cases that are common worldwide, at least on some level. We kind of in very brief study kind of try to understand that what are the properties, the attributes that you need to have in the IFC model in order to fulfill the information need for these use cases. And now what we are doing at the moment is that we are actually studying the technical layer about these attributes. So basically, we have tried to put together a set of properties and property sets that are needed for these use cases. And once we have like at least kind of a core of these attributes, properties and property sets, then we can start studying a bit more. Then we can start to study a bit more about the use cases and see kind of doing a pilots and seeing that are these attributes enough? Do we need more or do we need less? And kind of specify more in details these use cases, the exchange requirements for these use cases. So that's where we are. So we are at the moment building up the technical layer, and on top of that, we need to build up the process layer.
And part of the attraction of using the BSDD, the Building Smart Data Dictionary, is that it can act as a bridge between the language of IFC and the language that is used in regulations in different countries. So that means that we can stay multilingual, which is important, and we can use the BSDD to, I mean, it's primarily about properties and attributes, but there will be one or two entities and relationships that will come up, I think. One of the things I've learned in the last year is that the term escape route means many different things in different countries. In the UK, an escape route is something that the designer proposes and the regulator then accepts. So it's an actual line from a space to the outside. In other countries, it's the regulator that assesses the escape routes as to whether they're valid or not. And so there are going to be differences. There are going to be things that we can't resolve completely. And the other thing that I've been learning is that the meaning of a failure or rejection differs in different countries quite a lot. In the UK, it's not catastrophic to a project because ultimately they will inspect on the building site. And if there are things that can't be tested at the digital stage, the inspector can re-inspect actually on the building site. In Germany, my understanding is that there's no on-site inspection, so that the regulations, the digital or the virtual regulations are it's the last stage, it's the last step to get that technical approval. And so, you know, we can look at the detailed process, but we have to also recognize that around it, there are different appeals processes or challenge processes. What counts as evidence varies from country to country. But we're trying to keep the scope to be within the the core of representing a building, so that it can be checked. Whereas all around it, the way that information is used and the implications of failure and the implication and the supporting evidence and so on, that is really what changes from country to country. I think so we will continue to have that debate about the scope, but I think the regulatory information requirements is a really important thing to get in place, so that any country can pick up on the information and the recommendations and things that are in the IFC and the BSDD schema, and say, we can start this process. And then the other diagram that we included in the room of the stepwise thing, you can start by just saying you can submit an IFC as a supplementary information, as an illustration, as an introduction to the building. And I've met regulators who find that incredibly helpful. So before they start going through all the drawings, just to have a 3D model that they can see and understand the entirety. That's a basic step. And then you can say, well, the regulator can start using the model to find the information they're interested in, or to make measurements, or and so on. And then you can start thinking about automated compliance. So it's not a switch. I think there are a number of steps, and that's one of the things that the guidance will have to bring out. But obviously, what we've got in mind is that if people want to go to the automated compliance thing, we've given as much groundwork as possible.
A very short summary of the findings of the regulatory information requirements project so far is that IFC serves the regulatory use rather well when we are in the object or in the entity level, in the object level. So IFC works really well when you want to know that what's the fire rating of a door, or what's the width of the door, or is it accessible or something like that. But when it comes to identification of the project or fire zoning or that kind of like a more conceptual things, then we need to go to the technical room and ask for more attributes, more kind of maybe even entities to fulfill those needs. So that's the kind of brief summary of what we have found so far.
Yeah. So, okay.
I have a question about this. I tried to raise up a question about terms and terminology in general in the task group, but it was not. There was not a really enthusiastic applause about it. But I just to question for this group that. Because if we are trying to build up a project or identify what could be our projects in the future, how do you feel about creating a project for terms and definitions for regulatory use? For example, just an example that what is a regulatory process in this context? Have we specified that? What do we mean? We speak about building permits, we talk about building the authority use and stuff like that, but are those terms clear?
Speaking personally, I'm never too keen on terminology projects. I think it has to emerge from other work we do. If we find an issue, we can document it, but I wouldn't like to be locked in a room to define all these things for a number of months. I think if we find issues, and my example of the escape route as being a term that means different things in different contexts, I think that's something where if we can't resolve it into stuff in the existing schema, or even in corrections or additions to the schema, if we just say, if we discover that escape route really is too vague a concept or too varied, then that's a really important discovery if it turns out to be correct, and we should try and document that to say, we weren't able to resolve this.
Would it be enough if we just set up a kind of internal, I don't know, document where we collect these findings and sort of start building up the terms list? I agree that it could work like as a side project to our actual projects. So it's kind of a findings recorded in a document or something like that. Could that be a solution for this?
Yeah, I think that's a better approach. And yes, I mean, there are challenges. I mean, we will continue to adjust what we mean by regulatory room and regulatory processes and stuff. When I was thinking about the scope of this room, I always talk about 3 letter R's: regulations, requirements, and there's a third thing, which is recommendations. Things like environmental assessment schemes are trying to push people towards doing things, and they award extra points if you do this or if you do that, or and so on. There's all sorts of guidance documents which are trying to encourage people to do certain things for reasons of health and safety, or for constructability, or circularity, all sorts of virtues. And there are documents that are trying to push that. And once we've got machine readable regulations and machine readable requirements, we'll also have to think about how we handle those recommendations. Or I mean, they come under a lot of different names. Sometimes they're guidelines, sometimes they're schemes, and so on. But they all have maybe and should and would like and all sorts of words in them that mean that the rules are much more subtle, and so on. So our scope, a regulatory process is probably includes any of the checking processes that we carry out. We've had some comments from Masaki Mutu, apologies, and he's pointing us towards an ISO 15686, which talks about service life assessment. And indeed, he's pointing to a section of the standard, part 4, which I wrote, which is nice. And in fact, I'm in the process of revising it. So I think, I mean, there are areas of assessment around the regulatory environment which come up a lot, and all have information requirements attached to them. And what we tried to do in that 15686 was to say, this is how you would do it using IFC. And service life isn't a regulatory requirement. It's an analysis. And tomorrow I'll be in with the building room looking at fire and escape simulation. And that's sort of overlaps with us in that in many cases it's the same information you use in a regulatory environment as you would use in a simulation environment, and so on. So that's I mean, it's on the edge. Well, it's in our scope, but it's also in other people's scope, and so on.
In a way, the service life through the CO2 requirements and CO2 calculation and evaluation requirements, the service life actually is becoming also a regulatory item.
Yeah, that's good point. Good point. Yeah. And our colleague from France has left, so we can't challenge on what the European standard for service life numbers. How often are you going to have to replace the boiler? How often are you going to have to replace the windows? And it's an important criteria for life cycle assessment. And of course, manufacturers are very reluctant to give definitive service life. And the standard says it depends on the quality of maintenance and the harshness of the environment and so on. So yeah, there's. I think if we do a project on carbon, both embodied carbon and life cycle carbon, and all these different, we will probably end up getting into a lot of issues, which, as you say, things that used to be assessments are starting to move in the regulatory into the regulatory scope. The other point that Masaki makes is to mention the Interjurisdictional Regulatory Collaboration Committee. And I have to say, I know nothing. His question is, maybe they have some knowledge regarding international regulatory commonality. And should we have some kind of link or liaison with that work? Does anyone know anything about the IRCC? I think we'll just have to take that one away and Google it to death to find out if it's relevant to us. So that's a challenge. I'll write that one down with a big box saying Google this. And Masaku's other comment is, are we having the year 2025 off?
My bad.
Which is a nice idea.
Maybe we should.
If we get all these other things done.
Yeah. Have a vacation for a year.
Yeah. Okay. So I think we've covered most of the points and discussions. I don't think there's anything more coming through on the virtual side. Is there anything anyone else would like to discuss? We'll be talking about the Regulatory Information Requirements Project again tomorrow morning. And
maybe just a question that because this is the phrase that I've been saying many times, and we can maybe fine-tune it. But should we include one way or the other the what I've been saying, that the regulatory or the building permit or permitting process in general, permitting process is the key process, and without permit you don't build. So basically, if you don't have a building permit, there's no other use for the IFC data. Should we kind of maybe Nick, you can formulate it better, but
well, I think our top priority is regulatory compliance processes. Because that's our gold standard, and economically, I think that it could make a radical difference if you could get permission in days, not weeks. And the Singapore system gave you a result in 20 to 30 minutes. So I think that's going to stay our apex goal, our top goal. If we crack it, then things like client requirements and the kind of engineering requirements that you get in roads and rail will be relatively easy to do. The question will be how can we make them machine readable quickly enough, given that clients change their requirements weekly, and so on. So I think I think we're on the right track, and we've got to keep aiming for that. You said that in Finland it's one process for what I would call zoning permission or concept approval, or technical approval. Some countries have approval prior to construction. We're introducing that in the UK for residential buildings. And then some countries have a license to occupy permit, which depends on the as-built, it depends on inspections and so on. And of course, economically, that's the most tense one, because if you spent X billion pounds building a building and then you're told you can't occupy it, that gets really tense. So I think all the steps are important, however they're packaged up or joined.
But I mean the whole package. I'm not just talking about the moment that you get the building permit, but I'm actually talking about the whole, all these kind of steps in the process. So for me, it's one process from the early kind of conceptual permitting phases all the way to the occupation or the approval for occupation. So for me, this is all building permitting for me.
Yeah, and I think and what we picked out at the beginning, both you and I, is that it's a point when what essentially is a private process. I want to design and build a building. Meets the public sphere, the social sphere, the legal sphere, and puts things to the test. I know that different countries have got very different processes, and they group these different, or not all buildings have to have this construction, also pre-occupancy approval in the UK and so on. So I don't think we can standardize, or I don't think we've got a lot to say about the process side of things, although I do know researchers who are collecting process maps from across Europe and the USA for comparison processes, for comparison. But I think the key feature is in all these is that there is a moment when you have to say, I want to be reviewed for permission, and someone does the reviewing, and then the process continues. And that's what we need to improve, is that moment, or it can be weeks, it can be days, it can be hours, or whatever. But I think the challenge is that there is risk and delay and uncertainty and anxiety, and projects are cancelled because situations change, and so there's all sorts of things at risk, and it makes sense to try and get the best possible process there. Also, the best possible implementation at that point. Okay. Any other comments? Otherwise, I think we might reward ourselves with finishing a bit early. Okay. Thank you, Tomi, for leading this, and I think we're in a position to try and produce a final version of the roadmap, which is exciting.
I will work a bit more with that, and probably in the next steering committee meeting we will kind of we should be able to finalize.
And I really want to thank the people who've come to the room in person and contributed. And I hope that it's made the work of the regulatory room make sense of it and made it interesting, because we want to do more. We want you to help. We want you to be involved. So thank you. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.